Tonight in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And I put this out a little late, so not everyone got it, but I have an outline of the text if anyone would like to follow along on that, and then you can kind of circle words and phrases and that. If you want it, it's here. Maybe you got it on the way in, or if you just want to look on in the Pew Bible, that'll work too. We're going to do it tonight by reading all of 1 Corinthians chapter 8. This chapter holds together pretty well, and so rather than try to break it up, I think it's not a super long chapter, and I think we can tackle it all in one section. So I'd like a volunteer to read this, and I think we probably be best to get like 2 volunteers maybe. So maybe someone read 1 through 6, and then someone else to read 7 through 13. So I got Bruce. I'm going to have you read verses 1 through 6. Who'd be willing to read verses 7 through 13? All right, Jerry. So go ahead, Bruce. Start us off. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, starting at verse 1, and then Jerry pick up at verse 7. Okay. So in a minute, I'm going to have us do what we've done a few times here, and that's kind of go through the text and try to find some repeated words and phrases and things that will point us to the meaning. But I thought it might be good first just to give a bit of historical background here, because Paul is talking about a very particular problem that, at least on the surface, we don't deal with. Like, I don't think any of you are going to go home and wonder if it'd be okay to eat, have for dinner food that was sacrificed at an idol, to an idol somewhere. But I want to show you kind of how, if you sort of go to a deeper layer, you see something that does tie it in common. So Haley, I'm going to have you go to the next slide and just try to explain a little bit what Paul is talking about when he's talking about food sacrificed to idols. And maybe the place to start is to look at that quote there on the right-hand side. This is from an ancient manuscript that they've unearthed that came from around the time that Paul was ministering, and it's like an invitation. Honestly, it kind of sounds like a birthday invitation or and some kind of a celebration. So Apollonius requests you to dine at the table of the Lord Serapis on the occasion of the coming of age of his brothers in the temple of Thoresis, or Thoris. And so what you have here is really, it is a birthday invitation. Come, we're going to have a party because my brother he's coming of age. To be quite honest, it sounds like a 21st birthday party celebration, and so they're going to have this big party, and brother is throwing it for his little brother, and they're going to be having it at the temple. Now, of course, the temple was not the Jewish temple. It would have been like one of the pagan temples, and this was pretty common in the first century. I kind of learned that this week. I didn't really know that you could just kind of rent out a temple. It sort of made me think of like the riverfront carousel where, they've got that whole party room off to the side and you can rent that out and have a big celebration there. Well, apparently you could do that in the temples in the first century in Corinth or in Athens or wherever else. And so so that begins to give you a picture. In that time, you had religion and social interaction really closely woven together, so that a birthday party wasn't just a social event, but it had a lot of religious overtones, or a funeral wasn't just a social event, but it had heavy religious overtones. I mean, that does today too, but a lot of other things as well. Wedding celebration, funeral, any social event, even an anniversary dinner or something, would have very heavy religious overtones, and that's a problem when you're going to a party of a neighbor who is of a different religion, right? If your neighbor is worshiping the Greek gods and they want you to join in the party, and you go to wherever they're hosting the party and they're having meat and they're serving meat, it's sort of like it presents a problem for the believer. What do you go to the party and risk kind of rubbing up against all these pagan activities, or do you say, no, I'm not going to do that, and then you risk sounding very antisocial? So the other part of it is meat that was sacrificed to idols could be you could buy it at a discount. So if you have temple rituals going on, you're bringing all kinds of animals to be offered at the temple. Well, that meat just ends up otherwise going to waste. And so what they would do is they would sell that meat at a little discount meat shop, I guess, and they would sell it extra, and you could buy it quite a bit cheaper than slaughtering your own animals. But that too presents a problem, because if you're a devout believer, you don't want anything to do with idolatry. And so do you buy that meat and eat it even if it's been used in some temple sacrifice, or do you not touch it at all and refuse to even partake of it? So that's the question that the Corinthians are asking of Paul. I put those, is it permissible for believers to participate in social activities that may have pagan associations? And is it permissible for Christians to eat the meat that would have been used in pagan celebrations? Now, I should throw in one extra note here. I reference 1 Corinthians 10 there, verses 19, which gives sort of a nuance which doesn't exactly come through in this text. Paul will get to it a little later, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul says, I don't want you worshiping at these temples. You shouldn't be going up to the temples and actually participating in worship of the pagan gods. So that's off the table. All right. So I say that now because Paul will come back to that later, and I don't want to leave us with the impression that maybe Paul is okay with that. He's not. But in the meantime, we have to answer that other question: is it permissible for believers to participate in social activities that may have pagan associations? That's the question that the Corinthians wrote to Paul about, and they asked him about that. So to answer that, I'm going to have you do a little work now. Haley, go to the next slide over. And I'm going to have you work through the text, and I'll just give you maybe 3 or 4 minutes to go through. And as always, we're looking for repeated words, but this time pay a little extra attention looking for kind of structural words. And by structural words, we mean words that mark a transition in the text. And I put some examples up there: therefore, for, although, however, thus. Those are kind of words that mark a change in a kind of a change in the flow of the text, or sort of a connection between one section and the next. So look for repeated words, but also see if you can find any of those structural words that I put up on the screen for you, because that will help you understand the flow of thinking there. So I'll give you about 3 or 4 minutes to do that, and then we'll come back and see if we can make some sense of Paul's answer to the question. So go ahead and do that. Feel free to work in groups too. You don't have to do this alone. You can talk. Kind of makes it a little more interactive if you're talking with your neighbor, and that's fine. So go ahead and do that. About 3 or 4 minutes on that. maybe another minute or so to work on this. All right. Let's come back together and let's start off by looking for some of those structural words. Those are the words that help us outline the flow of thought in the passage. So what did you find? What did you come up with structural words? Maybe just say the word and then point to where you find it. Therefore, where did we find that? Yep. Right. So it's first word of verse 4, I think, and then of verse 13. And therefore is that word that essentially says, because of all that I've just said, here's the next conclusion or the next logical assumption. So because of verses 1 through 3, Paul says, now I'm going to explain what that means. And then at the end, it marks his conclusion to the entire problem or issue. Okay, so what else? What other words did you find? There's therefore. What other structural words are there? Yes. However is another good word. That is, of course, different from therefore because however really means that I'm going to qualify what I've just said. So I've just told you something, but I'm going to sort of nuance that a little bit now. So again, now you're seeing how the structure comes together. In verses 1 through 3, he lays out a principle. And then in verses 4 through 7, 4 through 6, he then comes to the next conclusion of that, or the sort of the next logical conclusion. But then in verses 7 through 12, he qualifies that. He says, okay, I've just explained something to you, but now I've got to make another point that's going to nuance this a little bit. And then he comes back again in verse 13 and states his conclusion. Any other, so those are the main structural words that I would point to. But there are a few other smaller ones that maybe kind of fit under those main headings. Did anyone? But, yeah, in verse 9. And what did you have, Sue? Yep. Yes, that's right. Yeah, although and yet. So it's kind of like, again, nuancing that bigger, the main point that he's working with, and then he's kind of fleshing that out with although and yet. So, and then but as well. So again, now yeah, Jerry, what else? What's the word? Oh yeah, no, that's right. That's in fact, in a way, that kind of one surprised me because you didn't think Paul was talking about knowledge, but it turns out that's one of his main concerns here. Okay, good. What other? So I hope you see kind of the big structure. And now we're kind of looking at some of the words that are repeated that kind of flesh this out. Knowledge or know is one of them. What else? Eating, yeah, eating, and the kind of the synonyms for that. There's eating and eating, eat, and then same thing with food or meat, right? So those, if, yes, verse 7, 8, 9, 10, yeah, if anyone sees you. Yep, but if, for if, that's right, good. Any other, yes, thus. Yep, that's right. That's another one of those good structural words that sort of indicates the flow of thought. Good. What else? Conscience. That's right. I see that at least 3 times in this. So now you're beginning to see some of these other words, knowledge and conscience and eating. And so clearly Paul wants to work with these ideas here. How does eating affect a person's conscience? What else? Yeah, idols. That's right. That's right. That's the focus. Yeah. And I kind of start up by highlighting the phrase food sacrificed or offered to idols, and then there's a couple different ways that he says it. So one, two, I count at least 3 times where you see that food sacrificed to idols, and then a couple more times where it's just built on eating in an idol's temple or food offered to idols. So yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yep. Stumble or stumbling block, and the Greek word there is scandalizo, and you hear the English word scandal there, right? Scandalize. So I almost think the word stumble doesn't quite go far enough in English, although I don't quite. Maybe just plug in the word scandalize, because Paul, because stumble can sometimes sound like a minor thing, like you're walking along and then, oops, I just stumbled a little bit. But to scandalize someone is to really throw them into a major crisis of sorts. So Paul's concerned about scandalizing other people as well with this issue. Other words that you noticed. Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah, where are you seeing that? I remember reading it. I just didn't highlight it. But mm-hmm. Good. Yeah, he does know. Yeah. So that contrast between those who think they know but don't, and those who maybe don't but actually are more insightful than we might think at first. Good. I'm trying to think if there are any. Yeah, weak would be the other one that I would point you to. Weak or yeah, weak. It appears starting in verse 7 and goes in verse 7, 9, 10, and 10, 11, and 12. So Paul's talking about the weak is in our word in our language. Maybe it means more. We look at that as more pejorative. And Paul, I don't think had that as a pejorative against someone that they weren't. Oh, look at you, you're so weak. It just more where they're at in terms of their maturity level. So you begin to get a sense here, right? Paul is talking about this issue about food sacrificed to idols, but he has a principle in mind that has to do with knowledge and love. He's concerned about, and that's in verses 1 through 3. He says, he starts off not even talking about food sacrificed to idols, but he talks about the difference between knowledge and love. And in a way, that's kind of we'd think that's a strange place to start, because we'd say, Paul, just get to the issue. But Paul, it's like he knows the Corinthians well enough to know that they struggle with this hierarchy problem, that they're putting some Christians at the super spiritual top, and then there's lesser believers and lesser yet. And Paul says, you know what? Don't fall into that trap. Don't let your knowledge somehow puff you up and make you feel superior to other believers. That's his concern that he starts with, because he knows that there are even deeper issues that are behind the main issue that the Corinthians are concerned about. So he wants to emphasize the importance of love in approaching this issue. Now, where does Paul come back to the whole theme and topic of love? 1 Corinthians 13, right? So when we get to 1 Corinthians 13, we're actually going to have to look at what Paul means when he's talking about love, because it's not the Valentine romantic kind of love. It's actually loving within the body of Christ, right? So he's already putting that thought in our minds here. How do we approach a potentially divisive issue in the church? Well, love is first and foremost. We've got to be practicing love rather than trying to use what we know to make ourselves feel superior to others. Then, so that's his main premise and his main idea that he lays out there in verses 1 through 3. Then in verses all the way 4 through about verse 11 or 12, Paul is talking to two different groups of people. So let's go to the next slide, and let's see if we can figure out the two groups of people that Paul has in mind. I realize the slide's probably a little smaller than is ideal, but there's in the first group, Paul's talking there in verses 1 through 6. And this is a group of people that it seemed would have had no problem going to the meat market and buying, a roast or a steak for dinner, even if that meat had been used the day before in some kind of pagan temple ceremony. But then what happens is they became prideful about it, right? They felt, look at my conscience is so much better than yours because I can go and eat this meat and it's not going to bother me. And, I understand spiritual things more than you do. So they were puffing themselves up. And they were becoming thus divisive in the church. That's who Paul is speaking to there in verses 4 through 6. And he's agreeing with them, right? He's saying, you know what? You're right. We know that an idol is just an idol. It's a piece of wood or it's a piece of metal. It's a statue, and it has ultimately no real meaning. So even if you're offering a food to the idol, what's happening there is effectively really nothing. It's just people, sacrificing to nothing. So Paul affirms that, and he agrees with them in their doctrine, but then he wants to challenge them, right? He's saying, the problem that you have isn't a theological problem. Let's call it an ethical problem. You're not being nice to those whose consciences are different, right? So that's where that's the first group. Those who know that it's meaningless. The food sacrificed to idols is really meaningless. The idols are nothing. Paul says, don't get, yeah, you're right. You don't need to get all flustered about that. Sure. Mm-hmm. He does. Yes. Yes, he does. Mm-hmm. That's right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. So, so Paul's problem with this first group isn't a theological thing; it's the ethical. You're not acting in love. You're not treating your brothers who may have a problem with this. You're not treating them with kindness. Yeah, Doris. You know what? Not exactly. You were what you weren't permitted to do was to, well, not exactly. I mean, it was you still could eat it, but what Paul is going to speak about is if it's going to trouble your brother's conscience. In other words, if you're going to, if someone comes up to you and says, hey, you know what, it's that food was misused in idol worship, and that really troubles me as a believer. I don't think we should be doing that. Then Paul would say, put the steak away, save it for another day. Don't eat that because not because eating the meat is wrong, and not because you're suddenly aware that it was used in idol worship, but because you're hurting another believer. You're troubling their conscience. That's the real issue. That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. That's that's exactly right. Alcohol, having a glass of wine, having a beer on a hot day, fine, right? Believers are free to do that, but there are some where that would be a real, that would really bother their conscience. I I made that mistake the first time I went to Ukraine. The Baptist churches in Ukraine are very opposed to any kind of drinking, like American Baptists kind of are, but in Ukraine it's like way off to the other extreme. And I made the mistake of just kind of making an offhand joke or comment about alcohol, and I'll tell you, I had some very angry Ukrainian people yelling at me, and I thought, oh, what have I done? But that's because they're now, are they right or are they wrong? In a way, that's not the point. The point is it troubles their conscience. Therefore, we're always very careful not to talk about the fact that we might, have a glass of wine with our dinner. That's exactly that same idea, because we don't want to trouble another person's conscience, right? So, and that's the second group, right? If you look on the right side, the second group that Paul is speaking to is there in verses 7 through 11, where those who felt that eating meat would have been a serious sin. And there could have been different reasons for that. One possibility is that, they had come out of the pagan culture. So they had maybe worshipped at these temples, and they had gone and participated in all of this religious activity at the temples. And so now to join into the Christian church and see little remnants of that may have been a stumbling block to them. And so Paul is not going to come out and say, yes, it's objectively wrong to eat that meat, but he is going to say for them, it's going to hinder their spiritual growth, right? So to use the example of alcohol today, we have a family member in our extended family who's a recovering alcoholic, and so a few months ago, my wife and some of the extended were getting together with the extended family, and someone kind of said just quietly beforehand, so and so is recovering, and could we please not have any alcohol? And of course, and we put it all away because for him that would have been a hindrance. It would have potentially pulled him back, and that's the right thing to do. That's what Paul is getting at with the second group. Although he does come down on the issue, he does say to them, food is just food, but so he in that way he's sort of challenging them a little bit to, remember that they can't make their position into an absolute, right? In other words, to use the contemporary analogy, it wouldn't be right for an alcoholic, a person who struggles with alcohol, to come out and say all alcohol all the time is absolutely morally wrong. Well, no, you have to recognize that for some things they are. It's a matter of conscience. So, any questions on that so far? All right, then I want to kind of summarize. Haley, let's go to the next slide. In some ways, we've covered a lot of this already, but just kind of, if you dig deep, I think these are the principles that Paul is after. The first is that love trumps knowledge, right? Our main commitment and obligation as believers isn't to insist on our rights, right? In other words, to the people who believe eating meat was okay, Paul says, you can't, don't insist on that, even if it may be morally okay. Don't play that card and say, well, I get, because it's not a sin, I insist on my right to eat the meat. Paul says, no, that's not the main principle. The main principle is loving your neighbor, and that might mean that you set the pot roast aside for another time in order to honor the conscience of your neighbor. And then the second principle, idols are not real gods, right? We don't need to be necessarily scared off just because someone says that has pagan associations. I guess the example in my mind too is, every time Christmas or Easter rolls around, or Halloween for that matter, you get people who are really concerned. Christmas is a pagan holiday because Christmas trees are pagan, and Ishtar is the goddess of fertility, and that's what Easter's named after, and Easter bunnies, and Halloween, is a devil's holiday, and so on and so forth. And to that I say, well, no, you know what? These are really just, they don't hold any meaning today. We aren't worshiping the goddess Ishtar at Easter, and a Christmas tree is usually just a Christmas tree. We don't need to assume the connections between idolatry. Halloween is usually just about kids dressing up and going out and having fun. It's not about any kind of devil worship. And so, we have to, I think the application is I think I'm justified in that application here, is based on what Paul is saying, that these are not real gods or goddesses, and so they really ultimately have no sway over us. There is only one God. And then the final principle, since love trumps knowledge, don't intentionally harm a person's conscience. If you know that what you're going to do is going to somehow hold them back in their faith, or hinder them, or trouble them deeply, then don't do it. I mean, show love for your neighbor by letting go of your rights and honoring them. Questions on any of these key principles? Love trumps knowledge. Yeah. That's right. You can be. That's right. Yep. Yeah. That's right. And we can be